Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're starting our coverage of the 2017 Grand Prix in Geneva. It's the third leg of the Grand Prix Tour. If you're not too familiar with how the Grand Prix is set up this year, there's going to be 4 tournaments. We've already had 2. Grand Prix Geneva is the third one. And the fourth one will be at the end of the year in November. There's 24 candidates, some of the top players in the world. Those competitors are going to be playing 3 of the 4 legs of the Grand Prix. So there will be players that are not present at this tournament that are actually in the Grand Prix. They're just going to be playing the other 3. The top 2 players from the Grand Prix at the end of the 4 will get invited to the Candidates Tournament in March of 2018. That's important because the winner of that will then go on to face Magnus Carlsen in November at the end of 2018. Sergei Kardiakin was the victorious person in the Candidates Tournament last year. And so he automatically has a bid into the Candidates Tournament for next year, so you won't see him. There are also some other notable players that you won't see in the Grand Prix series. Fabiano Caruana, Vishy Anand, Topalov, Kramnik, Wesley. So these are some of the players not trying to get a seat into the Candidates Tournament through the Grand Prix series. Instead, they'll be looking through the Chess World Cup, which is going to be in September. Going to be a really fun tournament, that one. It's 128 players, single elimination tournament. We will be covering that one as well. But today, we're going to be getting started with the Grand Prix Geneva. Our 2 competitors, White's going to be played by Anish Giri. He is currently 11th in the world. And also Radjabov playing the black pieces. He's 32nd in the world, but definitely a strong competitor. Played in the Candidates Tournament twice before. I think his earliest or latest one was about 5 years ago. So definitely looking to get back in that tournament. Both of these players did not play in the first leg of the Grand Prix. They did play in the last one, and they tied for third. So these tournaments are heavily skewed towards giving points to the person that wins the tournament. So both these players need a very, very good showing, if not need a win in this leg of the Grand Prix to kind of give themselves a shot of being in the top 2. With so many competitors, 24 competitors, every point counts. So we'll go ahead and get into it with Anish Giri starting out with pawn to d4, and then Radjabov starting with knight to f6. And we start to get into the Queen's Gambit decline line. And after bishop to e7, White has a few options. He decides to go with bishop to f4. Could also see bishop to g5, castle on the king side, maybe a knight to d7 here. Or could have even decided to play the exchange line. C takes here on d5. You could see the knight come back here, exchange. We now have a semi-open file on the C file and the E file. So a lot of different options as far as how Giri wanted to continue. He decided to go ahead and play bishop to F4. Now castle on the king side, Giri's going to solidify his pawn chain once he has his dark square bishop outside that pawn chain. With pawn to e3, also opening up for his light square bishop get involved. Then if he wants to go and castle on the king side. Knight to d7, you know, he has lots of options here. He could have just played knight to c6 if he wanted to. He could have even pushed forward with his pawn if he wanted to. Decides to go ahead and play knight here to d7, and then pawn up here to c5. This is a move we don't see all too often. Many times you'll start to see an exchange right here. Pawn takes on d5. The knight takes, all of a sudden this is completely fine. And this knight is no longer really supporting that knight here on f6. So White kind of has a leg up. He can bring his rook over here to c1, get his light square bishop involved into the game, castle on the king side. Very, very safe opening for White. But he decides to go ahead and try to cramp Black's position here with pawn here to c5. Now knight to h5, attacking the bishop here on f4. Decides to go ahead and ignore it with bishop to d3. And I really expected to see bishop to e5. Just not giving up your bishop early on into the game is something we usually see at high level play, but decides to go ahead and give it up. So bishop to d3, knight takes on f4, and then the pawn recapture. So White does have a double pawn structure here on the f file, and then pawn to c6. So kind of getting into a semi-Slav variation for Black. He could have tried to open things up with pawn to b6, starting to force an exchange, get his bishop here to b7, trying to control these light squares, but instead decides, okay, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to play pawn here to c6. Semi-Slav very known for solid defense and having a good pawn structure getting into the endgame, and he kind of looks at the board and said, White's not doing a whole lot here, and I have a better pawn structure than my opponent, so let's go ahead and play pawn here to c6. We'll have to be aware of his light square bishop. Sometimes in this opening, if you don't have it outside the pawn chain before you kind of close it off, it is sometimes difficult to get that bishop involved into the game. So he's going to be looking to do that. Queen here to c2, adding protection with the bishop on d3, eyeing down on this square on h7. So we have Radjabov to go ahead and play pawn to h6, just ignoring that threat right away, or not necessarily ignoring it, but making sure that he does not fall for that attack. Castle on the king side, queen to c7, just continuing his development. Also attacking the pawn here on f4. And this knight here on e5 does a couple things. One, it kind of forces his opponent at some point to allow white to no longer have double pawns. It also does stop the queen from attacking the pawn here on f4, since he doesn't really want to be playing things like pawn to g3. So we do have Radjabov decides to go ahead and exchange on board. So after the knight takes on e5, the pawn recaptures right here. So if we start to take a look on board, white does have a backwards pawn here on d4. So black can start to, if he can get behind enemy lines and start to attack this square, this is a weakness for white. On the other hand, black has a double bishop pair, but it's not an open board state. You usually want bishops where there's not a lot going on in the center of the board. Right now, there's no pawns that have even come off the board. So black is going to be looking to break up the center, really allow himself to utilize the bishops. Where from white side of the board, Anish Giri is looking to have the most powerful minor piece with the knight and really try to maneuver around the board and put himself in some really good outpost moves, really try to continue to keep his opponent cramped on board. Black wants to make sure he's not cramped. Bishop to d7, finishing his development, also allowing for the rooks to kind of connect right here. Now we start to see pawn pushing forward on the queen side. There's not much else that white can do right here. It is kind of blocked in the center of the board. Pawn to b6, so starting to break things up a little bit. Pawn b4, we do see an exchange, and then pawn to f6. And this is kind of one of those where usually you will see the rook immediately come here to b8, trying to control this open file right here. But black looks at it and says, there may be a better option. I need to start opening up this board state. And so f6 is really the only option that he has. Now, white does have a pretty solid move because you can just counter back with pawn to f4. If there is an exchange on here, that's going to be fine. So black decides not to go ahead and take right there. Now he decides to go and play rook to b8. But first wanted to go ahead and play that pawn to f6. Now Giri solidifies his pawn chain on the king side with pawn to g3, and then queen to a5, starting to try to have an aggressive attack on the queen side of the board. He does have control of the b file, so we can start to put pressure on this queen side of the board. Now the knight comes back here to e2, does not want to have to worry about all of his pieces, particularly his queen right now. Just defending the square here on c3, so brings his knight back here to e2. But this is also a pretty good square for black. If he looks at it, this minor piece can be very, very scary on a board that's kind of locked up because it can kind of move around, have some nice outposts. If it's back here on the second rank, that's exactly where Radjabov would like to see it because it's no longer threatening him. He's going to have a few moves because he can't really move it right now before he has to even worry about it. Bishop back here to e8. And then the bishop up here to g6. So black, looking to get his light square bishop involved into the game, decides to not bring it over here to c8 and then a6. Instead decides to go ahead and bring it here to e8 and then over here to maybe g6, depending on where his opponent is, or more than likely here to h5 and start to attack this knight on e2. And white kind of looks at it and says, I'll go ahead and exchange material if you want to, which I think is, fine for both sides. I think since black is a little bit cramped, I would prefer to hold on to as much material as white, but we do have Anish Giri decides to go ahead and exchange, and then queen up here to g6, and then queen down here to d2. And this is why I like it a little bit more for black. It's starting to put more pressure on his opponent. This queen is now attacking this backward pawn, as we talked about, on d4. It's attacking the knight here on e2. And we're kind of forced to see this rook here to f2, but now even more of white pieces are just holding down the fort. And black just finds an incremental better move with queen up here to e3. Still attacking all the same critical squares here on d4 and the knight, but it's also now pinning down this rook to the king. So white is good in material, has a good pawn structure, but all in all, black with this one piece here on e3 is starting to really dictate the play and what white can do, because so much of his material is kind of just blocked over here. And then black could eventually bring his rooks over to this b file and start to put even more pressure on his opponent. Now white's in a tricky spot. He was back at c2, but he can't really play that anymore, because after pawn takes on e5, then he's in a tough spot. He can't take with his f pawn, because then you just see queen takes on f2, check. That's going to be extremely bad. He can't take with his d pawn, because then just bishop takes on c5. That's threatening the queen down here to f2. That's also going to be bad. And if he tries something else, maybe rook over here to d1, well, then we just see pawn to e4, just putting more and more pressure on his opponent. This could definitely get a little bit tricky. You could see king to g2, but then the queen's going to take over here on a3, start to gobble up material, and then he has a pass pawn on the a file that he can start to push. With white really has to worry about his king side of the board. If instead he were to play something like queen to c1, trying to stop the queen from coming over here, then we talked about this earlier, but now the rook's going to come over here to b3, attacking this pawn. Next move, if he wants to, rook over here to b8, just putting more and more pressure on his opponent. So at the end of all this, we see that it's not going to be that good if he brings his queen back here to c2. So he finds a little bit better move, and that is queen to g4, but it's still not that great, but it does pressure this square here on e6, which is undefended. Black has two options. He could play h7, he could play f7. I really like f7 just because it protects the pawn on e6. He decides to go ahead and play king to h7, but he's the grandmaster in all of this, so we'll go ahead and heed to his play here. Queen takes on e6, and then rook over here to e8, looking for discovered attack. So after the bishop moves, then going to be attacking this queen here on e6. Pawn up here to a4, and this is kind of one of those where you almost feel like white forgets what the game is about. The game is not about this pawn over here on a3. If this was a pass pawn, maybe we could sit here and say maybe he has enough moves to do that, but that's not what the game is about. He has a lot of different options besides a4. He could play queen to f5, and then you could see pawn to g6, queen e6. You could see the pawn capture, queen capture if you wanted to. That's one option. You could have also played just queen takes on c6, start to gobble up material. Now pawn takes on e5. You could see the queen take on d5, pawn capture on d4. Just a lot of exchanges on board. Both sides really trying to gain control of the center of the board. This is a pretty even game right here. I think white is fine in this position. If he could go ahead and get one of these pawn chains off the board, his minor piece is going to do extremely well with just one side of the board with pawn structures. But he decides to go and play pawn to a4, not really threatening his opponent and definitely not advancing any of his initiatives that he has on board. So black says, okay, I'm going to continue with my game plan. Pawn takes on e5. And then the queen takes on e5, queen over here to d3. Black has a really good attack, does not want to exchange his queens off the board right now. Queen over here to h4. And we could see this bishop start to attack if he wanted to. Bishop here to f6. So then that's exactly what he does. This backward pawn's right here. The knight on e2 is protecting this, but he brings his bishop right here to attack it. A rook over here to f1. And this is where, it's really interesting to see these top level pros play, because it's very, very easy to just play bishop takes on d4. And I'm not even sure this is a terrible move at all. It pins down this rook here on f2. It gobbles up more material. He can even later on take here on c5, start to push his pawns, add more pressure. He could probably have a pretty good endgame with this, but he sees a slightly better option, and he plays pawn to g6, trying to put his opponent in a worse position. Queen here to g4. Pawn h5, kicking the queen. The queen comes here to d7. This is a very aggressive square for the queen, but also it's completely away from the action. The action's kind of going on the king side of the board for white. All of his pieces are just playing defense right now. The queen up here on d7, if he doesn't have the strongest of attacks, he's not really helping his team right now. That's kind of what we see. Rook here to e7, and then queen to d6, not helping at all. King to g7, and the knight here to c1. And this is where things start to get a little bit tricky for white, because yes, he is getting his knight to a square, hopefully where he can start to do something, but to do that, he has to bring it back to the first rank. That's not where he wants to be. His opponent can easily just bring his queen back here, and then all of a sudden he has a minor piece that's not helping at all. And if you kind of analyze this position more and more, black definitely has a much stronger attack, and Black's going to be sitting there attacking. White's going to be sitting there trying to figure out what he's going to be doing. Rook over here to d1, starting to attack or defend the square here on d4. Rook to e8, so black utilizing just the concept of controlling the open file, which is the e file, central square. Makes a lot of sense. And then white decides now, and only now, to start to gobble up material. So queen takes on c6. I do think it's a little bit late. Rook down here to e1. After rook to f1, we see a nice little decoy with bishop takes on d4. And this is a decoy because after the rook takes, then the rook takes on f1. After the king takes, then the queen can come down here to h3. And this is kind of going to be all she wrote. King to f2. Queen takes on h2, gobbling out material. And then after the check, the rook's going to come down here to e1. And this is going to be game over from here. And Giri resigns. So great game by Radjabov, being able to find a win after an opening where he just played defensive, waited for his opponent to kind of make a mistake, played solid throughout the game. Neither player really put themselves in a terrible position. Neither side really tried to go any crazy lines, tactics where you had to analyze and say, wow, there's these three crazy positions that both sides could go down. It was kind of straightforward, but at the end of it, small little variance in some of the moves that black played that white kind of chose suboptimal lines, and at the end of the day, black got the victory. Sometimes people will say, how could this game continue from here? You do see the checkmate here with queen to f1, and there's no really way for white to stop it. If he comes up here to queen to d7, trying to, a perpetual check, king to h6 is going to stop that right away. There's no real good way for white to continue to check his opponent. He could just continue to give away material if he wanted to, but at the end of this, it's going to be pretty futile. He will end up losing. So he decides to go ahead and just resign. So that is round one. Thank you everyone for watching. We will have coverage of every round. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for round number 2.